Morning. My name is Liz Wolf, and I grew up on a sheep farm. So let me say that again. My last name is Wolf, and I grew up on a sheep farm. So the backstory is that when I was 5 years old, we were living in a middle-class life in a posh suburb of Pittsburgh. And my mother decided she'd had enough of city life, and she and my father bought 148 acres outside of the city. Shortly thereafter, and unbeknownst to my father, my mother purchased her first 3 sheep. 3 years later, we were up to over 100 sheep. My parents were getting divorced, and we quickly went from gentleman farmers to figuring out how to eke a living relying on the sheep and my mother's resourcefulness. We eventually had as many as 300 sheep. And we ran a cottage industry selling wool and lamb products. So in the rural community where I lived, almost every other farm was a dairy farm. And sure, those farmers might have other animals like a pig or two to raise for slaughter or a horse to ride. But the sight of those woolly white creatures dotting the hillsides of our farm was an anomaly there. Add to that the fact that my mother was a woman farmer, completely on her own and only with daughters. It pretty much blew the minds of the other local farmers. Now, one of the reasons why so many people turn to dairy farming is because of all the types of farm businesses, the income is the most steady. A farmer who was milking a herd of, let's say, 25 to 80 cows could produce enough to get, at that time, a consistent income of $100 to $150 a week by selling the milk. But sheep farming is different. Traditionally, there are only 2 sources of income from a sheep: the wool that you get once a year, or selling the lambs for meat at the market. I remember the flurry of activity that happened every spring when we were shearing the sheep. My job was to take the newly shorn fleece to the top of the barn and add it to the growing pile. We eventually loaded the fleeces into the back of a truck and drove it to what's known as a wool pool, a place where all the sheep farmers would line up to have their wool graded for its cleanliness, its length, and its strength. So we were paid by the pound for the wool. An average fleece from one sheep weighs 7 pounds. In 2019, last year, or the year before, the price being paid per pound of wool was $1.89 per pound. That is less than $14 per sheep earned. At the time we were farming in the mid-70s, the price was actually much lower, sometimes as low as 40 cents a pound. That is less than $3 per sheep earned. As a result, my mother used her considerable fiber arts skills to begin to create finished products like yarn and sheepskin clothing. And what we did was we took those items to craft fairs where we would sell them retail. We would also bring along a spinning wheel to spin wool to attract people to our table as we educated them about the virtues of wool. There were even times when we brought live sheep to shear, including the notorious time when we took them in the elevator in an office building during Three Rivers Arts Festival in Pittsburgh. There were other times that we cooked and sold lamb and other food at the local festivals. Going to those festivals was a major part of my growing up experience. And you know what my main takeaway was? Most people are completely disconnected and uneducated about what it takes to produce the food that they eat and the clothing that they wear. Our biggest joke was imitating the typical passerby who would say, "Oh, look, they're weaving goat hair into string." Not a goat, not weaving, not string. Or they would crinkle up their noses at the delicious food we were preparing and say, "Oh, how could you hurt those cute little lambs?" My absolute favorite, though, was hearing about my friend's mother who lived in our community, in our rural community, who stopped drinking milk when she learned that it came from a cow. Where did she think it came from? A farm. But I learned later that I was uneducated too. For years after moving to New York City, I scraped my leftover food into the regular trash, not understanding that the food and the organic materials in our landfills is a major source of climate warming methane gas. I bought clean, white, and perfectly even eggs sold in styrofoam cartons, not thinking about the factory farms where they came from. I took my young children to McDonald's where they could get Happy Meals made of ultra processed chicken and beef that was raised by burning down rainforests. I was enjoying living the city life where I could let somebody else worry about how to get the food I ate to my table. I'm a bit embarrassed to admit I really didn't know that much about factory farming, the plight of migrant workers, how our food production impacts climate change, how much food is wasted, and why it's so important to compost. That's why now that I'm part of the environmental justice team, we decided to host Food Justice Month this month in January to bring awareness to our 4th U community and beyond about these important issues. Today, we're going to be hosting the Immokalee Workers, who you'll be hearing from both during the service and who will be presenting a program after church, which we hope you will stay for. And for the next 3 Tuesday evenings, we'll have presentations featuring expert panelists who will talk about food justice, climate change, food insecurity and hunger in New York City, and food waste and composting. So we will be providing a link to you. We urge you to register and to participate in these presentations so that we can all become more educated about food justice and advocacy actions that you can take. We'll be providing the registration link throughout the service and during the announcements. Now, for my part, I'm striving to be more educated and conscious about food and how my choices impact the health of my body, my community, and my earth. So let's join together to make a difference in alignment with our Unitarian Universalist principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for that wonderful story. I'm really excited to share mine because I feel like we were neighbors in a spiritual sense. So I was asked by the Social Justice Committee, particularly around food justice, to join you all today and share a little bit about my thoughts and feelings, because this work is amazing work. And I try to support it as much as I can in the ways that I can. Today, I am speaking to you not as the Director of Membership and Hospitality, but as a Unitarian Universalist who strives to live out our Unitarian Universalist principles on a daily life, in my daily life. I wanted to start by talking, of course, about farming. My mother grew up on a farm in New Zealand, and it was a dairy farm. And the farm was owned by my grandfather. The real farmer was my grandmother, but he learned a lot about farming through her. The whole family was required to do some work to help it function. And I remember visiting my grandparents during my winter or summer breaks from school. I would wake up before the sun would rise in the morning and go out to tend to the cows. It was usually winter time when we visited, so the mornings were often very cold. When I was really little, my mom showed me how to feed the cows grain or hay. I probably thought it was grain, but she later corrected me and said it was hay. I would watch from a safe distance as my grandfather and my mother would take the dogs out to migrate the cows from one field to the next. And sometimes the bulls got out to mingle with the cows. My grandfather had been impaled by a bull's horn at one point in time. And this was during the time that the cows were in heat, and he had forgotten that the bull was still in the pasture. So safety first, always safety when working with large animals. As I matured, our visits required more work from me. So on my 20th birthday at 4:30 a.m., I got up and I was fully dressed in a bodysuit from like my ankles to my neck. And I had to have these rubber boots that came up to my knees. And we would bring the cows in from the field to the milking barn. I learned manual labor and machine labor in terms of how to milk the cows, and what the difference was between hand milking and machine milking. And I also learned what the best way was to keep the cow teats from cracking as you milk them. So we'd have like some oil that we'd put on them just to make the cows comfortable. The cows even had special massage machines to keep them happy and relaxed. And every once in a while, my mom and I would sing to the cows because we thought that they might enjoy that as well. Even though my time at my grandparents' was a lot more labor and a lot less vacation, I loved being on the farm. The smell of the cows, the feed, even the manure, the milk, and the rain have like left an imprint on my brain. And I visited dairy farms here in New York, and I'm instantly transported to my grandparents' farm, which is 9,094 air miles away. Everything we ate came from the land my grandparents lived on. The meat, the fruit, and the vegetables, everything, even the ice cream we had for dessert. It was so amazing to me to see this connection with the land, the plants, the animals. The food seemed to taste better, so much better. I wanted to live like this all the time, but my life in the United States was much different, much more fast paced. My mom did what she could to recreate this experience. We would often visit fruit farms and pick our own fruit rather than, buy them from the grocery store. For a few years, we had a contract with a couple local farms to pick up frozen vegetables from them during the harvest seasons. It was so much harder to live off the land. Eventually, my mom found a nice spot on her own property, and she started growing some vegetables like kale, cucumbers, squash, and tomatoes. Every year, the number and the quality of the vegetables improved. We just have to watch out for the local wildlife who enjoy the cornucopia of offerings in her yard. It wasn't until I went to college and studied sociology that I began to realize some of the injustices that were taking place around food and food production. I slowly became aware of how competitive the food industry was and how that competition led to the mistreatment of animals as well as the human beings who were working on the farms. I was shocked to see the condition of the animals. The business of farming turned the experience into a mechanized production of inputs and outputs rather than this organic symbiotic relationship between us and nature. We need them and they need us. I began to encounter those who presented themselves as food justice warriors. This was often through a book, a lecture, or a very dramatic video or movie that left you feeling like you wish you didn't need to eat to survive. I remember one incident, it always sticks with me. There was a discussion about chicken farms, and I felt awful for the farmers who owned their farms and they were in continuous debt. I felt terrible for the workers who were getting chicken feces in their eyes from how the chickens were caged, and the chickens themselves who are packed in such small spaces that they'd end up with infections and injuries. One farmer showed a coop in which the chickens were walking over the dead ones as if it was part of the flooring. There was a time for a group discussion, and one of the presenters shamed me for continuing to want to eat chicken and eggs, even after the information that I had received from them about these chicken farms. She said, "It's people like you who are the real problem. You don't care about how anyone is treated." I care. I care deeply. But I know the solution isn't to just stop eating chicken and eggs. I wasn't the only person in the room who has worked on their diet. America has the biggest health problems for a developed nation and has the highest obesity rate. Each person has their own personal relationship with what they put into their bodies and how their body responds to it. There are some folks who are restricted by what they can eat based on food allergies or their own organs that are limited in its function to process certain foods. They are restricted by religious beliefs around where the food comes from, and also finding an enjoyable alternative that is economically sustainable. It took me until my 20s to realize that my body doesn't have the enzymes to process red meat. And this was a huge shift in my diet. I had to form a practice around finding alternatives that didn't cause me physical discomfort and were also enjoyable. I also see the economic challenge of changing one's diet. It was a process to find alternative foods that cost the same. There is this continuous struggle to find a balance between eating healthy and eating what you can afford. There are families who are looking to make financial decisions about what to feed everyone. So if families are using food stamps and WIC checks, how many fresh vegetables and fruits are they allotted to support their family for the week? For pregnant and nursing women, how often can they receive dairy alternatives like oat or pea milk when using food stamps or their WIC checks? If I were to stop eating eggs today, I would also have to consider what I will be consuming instead that my body can process and that I can afford. I've worked very hard to become a homeowner with enough land that I can grow my own food and maintain animals, which I use to support my diet. This is not easy. It's not inexpensive. There are zoning rules I have to follow and neighbors I must communicate with about my property and how it may impact theirs. And I'm at this program because I want justice and I'm trying to do my part. So what is one role that I play? Well, I quite literally play with puppets. I have joined a theater company 7 years ago, which combines art, ecology, and social action. The company uses puppet theater as a symbolic visual language that can illuminate the links between human communities and the life support process of this planet. All of our pieces talk about the connections that humans have with our planet and what we can do to maintain healthy relationships, sustaining our ecosystem. One of our timeless pieces is called La Cosecha, the harvest, in which we present the issues of migrant farmers and the farming industry. I want folks to engage in a positive relationship between themselves and the food they eat. The way I remember my grandparents and their farm. The desire to make changes in one's lifestyle and to engage in food justice should come from a place of love rather than a place of guilt and shame.
Thank you, Soyal. Even though we are apart, the needs of the world remain. Our offering today is shared with the Coalition for Immokalee Workers and the Alliance for Fair Food. We are thrilled to be joined by them today to share a little bit about their work on behalf of farm workers. We also hope you join them and the environmental justice team after the service for a special program that dives deeper into their work and the moral importance of food justice. Welcome, Julia de la Cruz and Uriel Zelaya Perez. Bienvenido.
Gracias. Muy buenos días. Mi nombre es Julia. Soy parte de la coalición de trabajadores Immokalee de aquí de la Florida.
Yeah, so thank you. First of all, good morning. My name is Julia de la Cruz, and I'm a farm worker staff member with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And my name is Uriel, and if you haven't guessed it, I'm going to be interpreting for Julia today.
Gracias por darnos el espacio y también agradecer de que ustedes siempre, la iglesia, nos ha dado la oportunidad y nos ha apoyado.
So first of all, thank you so much for giving us the space to share a little bit about our work. thank you to Fourth U for being a kind of congregation that gives us this opportunity to talk about this important issue.
Bueno, nosotros quienes somos, la coalición es una organización que ha venido luchando por los derechos, y también eliminar los abusos que se han cometido en el lugar de trabajo, acoso sexual, esclavitud y todo lo demás, el trato con los trabajadores agrícolas.
Yeah, so to start off with, to give a little bit of background, who is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers? So the Coalition, the farm worker-led human rights organization that is focused on improving the human rights and conditions that farm workers face and eliminating abuses that farm workers tend to face when working in the fields. When we talk about abuses, we talk about things like gender-based violence that farm worker women experience, cases of modern day slavery and human trafficking that are run rampant in the agricultural industry.
Y compartir también con el trabajo que hemos hecho, principalmente, hemos creado de tanto largo años de trabajo, se ha logrado tener un programa. ¿Y cuáles son esos programas? Pues invitando a los grandes compradores a que se unan y cómo juntos lograr eliminar todos esos abusos, y donde ellos compren, pues que sea un lugar digno y respetable de comprar.
Yeah, one of the things that we've done in order to address these systemic abuses has been by implementing now for many years a program called the Fair Food Program. This program came about by pressuring big-time food corporation, fast foods, and grocery stores, demanding that they purchase from farms where farm workers are being treated with dignity and with respect when doing this work.
Y así hablar también nuestro éxito, cómo hemos llegado hasta acá y por qué nosotros seguimos luchando, por qué seguimos en la campaña. Y todo eso vamos a hablar con ustedes más adelante.
Yeah, and we can share a lot about the stories of how we managed to create this program, and a lot of it will be shared in the program that we're going to have after the service to talk a little bit about how we've managed to bring about human rights for farm workers in the tomato fields of Immokalee.
Y también ver del programa, ver qué tanto logro hemos tenido, cuáles son los resultados que tenemos. Y también cómo seguir trabajando de que este programa efectivo, ¿verdad? Otra industria también lo pueden utilizar como modelo.
Yeah, and we'll also be sharing a little bit about the results of this Fair Food Program that I would add has turned an industry in Immokalee known as ground zero for modern day slavery back in the 90s and 2000s to being recognized as one of the best workplaces for farm workers in the world today. And how this program is also being used by fellow workers. I would add dairy workers, which we've been hearing a lot of dairy stories today, how dairy workers are seeing this program as a means, as a tool to bring about protections and rights for themselves in their different industries.
Y también cómo nosotros seguimos aquí en nuestra comunidad, ¿verdad? Luchando también de que como sabe, estamos en la plena pandemia, entonces como los trabajadores agrícolas son trabajadores esenciales, como también ver cómo podemos obtener también las pruebas y cómo ahorita con la vacuna y todo eso. Entonces es un trabajo también que se está haciendo y vamos a hablar un poco de esto.
Yeah, and at the same time that we talk about this work of human rights and worker protections, farm worker protections in the industry, we also need to acknowledge the fact that farm workers are also facing the same thing that we're all facing, which is COVID right now. Many farm workers are being affected drastically by COVID. Many, I would add, have lost their jobs or lost ways of income. And at the same time, although they have been deemed essential workers, farm workers they haven't necessarily been treated or been given the resources to protect themselves from COVID, as you would expect essential workers to be protected. Entonces le damos una bienvenida. Well,
Ujú.
so besides that, I know we want to express our gratitude to you all. I also want to mention that although our Fair Food program has managed to create a lot of changes for farm workers, there's still a lot that needs to be done, as has been mentioned. One of the main campaigns that CIW has at this moment is with Wendy's, which I'm sure many of you might have heard before at 4th U. Wendy's is one of the main corporations that continues to refuse to partner with the CIW farm workers. They have been shown to purchase from farms where there's children as young as 7 working in the fields, where there's rampant gender-based violence happening in those fields. And so for us, it's also incredibly important to continue to do this work and to remember that farm workers are part of that food system, probably the most integral part of that food system. And so if you want to learn a little bit more about that, we again invite you to join our presentation afterwards. And again, we're just so gracious to you all for giving us the opportunity to share these words with you all during the service. So thank you.